Welcome to Headline Wednesday from Dispatch, U.S. Military History Magazine, developed by trackpads.com. Each week, we take one pivotal moment from United States military history and follow it from the first warning signs to the final outcome. Today, we go to the Western Pacific in the early months of the Second World War for the story of the Doolittle Raid. The sun has not yet burned through the gray Pacific haze when 16 twin-engine Army bombers sit lashed to the wooden deck of an American carrier. This ship was built to launch fighters and dive bombers, not land-based medium bombers with long wings and heavy fuselages. Waves slam against the bow and send sheets of spray up and over the forward aircraft as the ship pushes into the wind. On the deck, crews in heavy jackets move carefully across the slippery planks, checking fuel caps, bomb shackles, and the makeshift extra gas tanks that fill every space they can reach. The scene feels improvised, yet tightly focused. On the lead bomber, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle runs through his final checks with the crew, speaking into the interphone while eyes and hands roam over gauges and controls. Each man understands that once they leave this deck, there will be no circling back to land here again. The B-25s have been stripped and modified, tuned in training runs to lift off in distances more suited to small fighters, not medium bombers. Yet there are limits to what engines and faith can do. Up on the carrier's island, signal flags move and arms gesture in practiced motions as ship's officers talk silently with the flight deck crews. Engines roar to full power, propeller wash whips at jackets and helmets, and loose gear skitters away across the planks. Everything narrows to the length of that deck. One by one, the bombers creep into position at the very edge of the bow, noses pointed straight into the Pacific wind that now feels like a living thing. Out beyond the gray line of the task force, the Japanese cities these crews will fly toward have not yet seen American aircraft overhead. On the decks of escorting cruisers and destroyers, sailors pause in their work to watch, knowing they are witnessing something new. For the pilots strapped into their seats, and for those sailors looking on, the moment feels like a hand reaching farther than the war has yet allowed. The first bomber rumbles forward, staggers off the bow, dips toward the waves, then slowly climbs. That brief dip steals everyone's breath. When the airplane finally pulls away and gains altitude, men on deck exhale as one. Each successful launch is more than a technical triumph. It is the opening act in the first American strike at the Japanese home islands, improvised in a matter of months and hinging on every aircraft getting safely into the air. As the next B-25 takes the deck and begins its own run, the sense of risk and possibility wraps around steel, gasoline, and human resolve. A dangerous idea is now in motion. This scene in April 1942 does not arrive out of thin air. 4 months earlier, Japanese carriers had smashed the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, sinking battleships and killing thousands of sailors in a single morning. Across the Pacific, the United States and its allies are still reeling as Japanese forces advance into the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and toward vital shipping lanes. At home, anger and shock share space with a grinding frustration as bad news arrives in report after report. Leaders know that speeches and promises of future victory are not enough. The country needs to see a visible blow landed against Japan itself. Out of that need comes an idea that is simple to describe, yet complex to carry out. Use an American carrier to bring United States Army medium bombers close enough to the Japanese home islands for a one-way strike, then send them on toward airfields in China. The United States Navy will provide the ships and the approach across the Pacific. The United States Army Air Forces will provide the aircraft, the crews, and the bombs. This plan means taking a valuable carrier and its escorts dangerously close to an enemy coastline that bristles with patrol planes, submarines, and radio stations. It also means asking bomber crews to launch knowing that, even if they hit their targets, they probably will not land on friendly soil that night. The stakes reach far beyond the physical damage that 16 bombers can inflict on factories, dockyards, and military facilities clustered around Tokyo and other cities. For President Roosevelt and his advisors, a successful strike will boost American morale at a dark hour and force Japan to adjust its defenses. Japanese planners will have to divert aircraft and ships to protect the home islands instead of sending them to distant fronts. In Japanese government circles, the appearance of American bombers over the capital would be a shock to public confidence and a direct challenge to the belief that the home islands are safely out of reach. One raid can change how both sides think. For the men in the task force and in the bombers themselves, the mission carries a more direct and personal weight. If enemy patrols discover the carrier group too early, Japanese forces could pounce on an exposed carrier in the open ocean. The bombers might have to launch from even farther out, shaving already thin fuel margins down to almost nothing. Yet, if the Americans turn back, they abandon the chance to show that they can reach into Japan's own skies. In that narrow space between risk and necessity, the Doolittle Raid takes shape as one dangerous idea that the United States is willing to try. It is a gamble the crews now carry into the wind. The gamble the crews carry into the wind begins in the weeks after Pearl Harbor, when American planners face a stubborn problem. The country demands a blow against Japan, but the tools at hand do not reach far enough. Carrier air groups can hit enemy fleets and island bases, yet their dive bombers and torpedo planes lack the range and bomb load to strike deep into the home islands and still return. Long-range Army bombers can carry that punch, but they live on runways, not on rolling wooden decks far out at sea. Out of that mismatch comes a proposal that sounds almost impossible. Load land-based medium bombers onto a carrier, steam them close enough to Japan for a one-way strike, then send them on toward friendly airfields in China. James Doolittle, already famous as a test pilot and racing aviator, takes on the role of planner and leader. He gathers volunteer crews from stateside bomber groups, men told that the mission will be exceptionally dangerous but given few details. They understand that being picked means carrying a heavy risk. The aircraft chosen is the B-25 Mitchell, a twin-engine medium bomber with enough range and toughness to make the idea at least plausible. Mechanics and engineers begin modifying the bombers in every way they can think of. They strip out unnecessary equipment, add extra fuel tanks in bomb bays and fuselages, and tune engines for every bit of power and efficiency they can coax from them. Some defensive guns are removed to save weight, and clever improvisations appear, such as dummy gun barrels in the tail meant to discourage enemy fighters without adding the bulk of real turrets. The bombers become flying compromises between range, firepower, and the simple need to get off a short deck. Training takes place on quiet American airfields where a white rectangle painted on the ground stands in for a carrier deck. Crews practice short takeoffs again and again, roaring down runways as if they have only a few hundred feet to spare and no second chances. Pilots learn how to hold brakes, bring engines up to full power, and then release at just the right moment to squeeze every foot out of the run. Navy flyers with experience in deck operations share tips on judging the end of the deck, using the wind, and trusting the feel of the aircraft in those first seconds after liftoff. Each practice run turns an unlikely concept into muscle memory. At the same time, the Navy assembles the task force that will carry these bombers across the Pacific. The carrier Hornet is chosen as the launching platform, and its normal air group is largely left ashore to make room on the flight deck. Another carrier, Enterprise, will sail nearby to provide fighters and additional scouting aircraft, extending the eyes and claws of the group. Cruisers, destroyers, and support ships form a protective ring, bringing anti-aircraft guns, radar, and fuel. Behind the scenes, secret agreements with Chinese authorities arrange for landing fields on the far end of the mission, though everyone knows that maps, weather reports, and radio navigation aids cannot fully tame the unknown conditions that await. By early April 1942, the plan hardens into formal orders. The combined force slips out into the Pacific under strict radio silence, trading chatter and comfort for secrecy. On their decks, sailors walk past Army bombers crowded wingtip to wingtip, a sight that captures the strange and urgent improvisation of the moment. What had been a daring concept on paper is now a line of steel hulls pushing westward. One dangerous idea has become a column of ships, aircraft, and men who all understand that their margin for error is very thin. As the task force pushes deeper into the western Pacific, tension rises on the ships and among the bomber crews with every mile. Lookouts scan the horizon for the small silhouettes of Japanese patrol craft. Submarine alerts and rumors flicker through mess decks and ready rooms as the carriers and their escorts edge into waters where discovery could bring enemy aircraft down on them in force. The plan calls for launching the bombers when the ships reach a point roughly 400 to 500 miles from Japan. At that distance, the B-25s should have a real chance of reaching Chinese airfields after dropping their bombs, as long as weather and winds cooperate. This timing assumes several things that are easy to write and hard to guarantee. It assumes fair weather and steady tailwinds to stretch every gallon of fuel. It assumes no early alarm from enemy scouts or patrols. It assumes that navigation to and from the targets will go smoothly enough that crews do not lose extra time and distance correcting course. Every hour the task force steams closer to Japan without being spotted feels like a victory. Every report of a possible contact tightens the knot in stomachs across the formation. On the morning of April 18, that fragile balance cracks. American ships spot small Japanese picket boats, part of a loose net of scouts spread across likely approaches to the home islands. The Americans engage and sink at least one of these craft, but not before it sends some kind of warning message toward shore. Commanders have to assume that their presence is now known, even if the Japanese do not yet know exactly what kind of force is out here. The calm assumption that they might arrive unannounced disappears in an instant. Now the plan reaches its real crossroads. Turning back would abandon the raid and send the crews home, having risked a carrier and escorts for nothing but a dangerous cruise. Pressing on without change would mean sailing closer to an alerted coastline where land-based aircraft and submarines might be waiting. The decision is made to launch immediately, hundreds of miles farther out than originally planned. For the men in the bombers, this choice means starting their run with fuel margins shaved down to a sliver. They will take off knowing that every extra mile of ocean now stands between them and any runway in China. On Hornet's heaving deck, the decision turns into urgent movement. Deck crews lash down loose gear, check chocks and tie-downs, and ready the first bomber for takeoff as the carrier swings into the wind and drives its engines to maximum speed. Spray breaks over the bow, soaking the forward aircraft and blurring the already short visual line between deck and sea. Doolittle's aircraft rolls into the first slot, nose poised over the edge of planking that seems barely long enough. Engines roar, propellers blur, and when the signal comes, the bomber rumbles forward, gathering speed along a strip that appears, to watching eyes, far too short. For a moment, witnesses see the wheels leave the deck and the aircraft dip toward the waves, the underside of the fuselage alarmingly close to the water. Then the nose rises and the B-25 claws its way into the air, trading speed and skill for altitude. One by one, the remaining bombers repeat the sequence. Each takeoff a separate small drama watched by silent sailors lining the island and catwalks. Every successful launch draws a breath that no one realizes they were holding. When the last bomber lifts away, the flight deck feels both emptier and strangely lighter. Once airborne, the raiders do not form a tight parade ground formation. Instead, each crew takes responsibility for its own path across the empty sea toward assigned targets. They fly low over the water to delay detection by radar and visual observers, watching the horizon for ships and the sky for changes in weather. The monotony of long overwater flight mixes with constant, quiet tension as navigators check headings and timers. Hours later, the hazy outline of Japan's coastline appears, a line of hills and cities they have only known from maps and briefings. The moment when coastline moves from paper to reality confirms that the first half of the plan has worked. The bombers climb to working altitude and fan out toward their assigned cities: Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and others in the industrial belt. Below them, Japanese civilians and soldiers look up at unfamiliar silhouettes and markings, trying to make sense of aircraft that do not match the standard profiles they know. Air raid sirens begin to howl, and anti-aircraft guns swing skyward, tracing ugly black bursts into the air. The small number of attacking aircraft, their speed, and the element of surprise all work in the raiders' favor. Blind spots in defense that once felt theoretical now show themselves in real time. Over Tokyo, Doolittle's bomber and others sweep in over industrial and military districts. Bomb bay doors open, and bombs fall toward factories, dockyards, and other targets tied to the Japanese war effort. Fires and pillars of smoke begin to mark where bombs strike, though the crews have little chance to study results. They stay only long enough to complete their runs and avoid the worst of the flak. Then they bank away and head out over the countryside, trading time over target for the precious minutes they need to reach the next phase of their journey. At Nagoya and other cities, similar scenes unfold. Low-flying American bombers arrive suddenly in the sky over plants, rail yards, and port facilities, startling defenders who scramble to respond. Anti-aircraft batteries throw bursts of fire into the air as quickly as they can, and some shells come close enough for crews to hear fragments rattling against their aircraft. Japanese fighters rise from airfields, but they struggle to find and intercept small groups of raiders that are scattered across different routes and altitudes. Many of their passes are brief, hurried attacks rather than sustained engagements. When the bombs are gone, the mission does not end. The raiders now face the longest and most uncertain leg of the operation. Turning southwest, the pilots point their noses toward China and throttle back to conserve every drop of fuel left in their tanks. The weather worsens as they fly into thickening cloud and growing darkness. Headwinds, stronger than forecast, eat into their remaining range, turning each mile into a more bitter trade of fuel for distance. Promised radio beacons and navigation aids fail to provide clear, steady guidance in the stormy air. Those choices in the dark sky define the true turning point of the raid. What happens next unfolds far from cameras and headlines, but it decides who lives and what the mission finally means. For each crew, that turning point comes not over Tokyo's rooftops, but in the hours afterward when fuel gauges sink and land stays invisible behind cloud and night. The early launch, forced by the encounter with Japanese picket boats, has already reshaped the mission in ways no one can ignore. It means every bomber is short of the fuel cushion they trained around, the safety margin that once felt thin and now feels almost gone. Yet that same decision is what preserved the chance that any of them would reach Japan at all, and it keeps the carrier force from steaming into a deadlier trap. On the surface of the ocean, the call to launch early looks like a desperate adjustment. In the larger balance of risk, it is the only move that truly keeps the raid alive. As night closes in, weather over China shifts from quiet ally to hard obstacle. Headwinds, stronger than forecast, steal precious miles from every gallon of fuel, turning the long flight into a slow fight against the air itself. Low cloud and rain hide rivers, roads, and airfields that had seemed solid and dependable when traced on maps back in training. Inside those cramped cockpits and noses, crews huddle over charts and compasses, trying to match dead reckoning with fragmentary radio bearings that flicker and fade. With engines sipping the last reserves in their tanks, pilots and bombardiers face a choice that is simple in words and brutal in reality. Press on toward unseen runways, or bail out into whatever lies below, whether that is sea, mountains, or farmland. Many crews decide that their best hope is to climb as high as they dare and then order jumps, trading the idea of a controlled landing for the chance that scattered men on parachutes will survive and regroup. In those moments, the raid stops being a series of planned waypoints and becomes a string of individual decisions taken in the dark. Some aircraft make it close enough to attempt crash landings, skidding across rough ground and breaking apart even as crews scramble out. Others see only clouds and blackness, counting down the last drops of fuel before stepping out into empty air. The raid that began with a tight plan now unfolds as dozens of separate survival stories. On the ground in China, another series of turning points begins. Chinese soldiers, guerrillas, and civilians move quickly to find downed airmen, often reaching them before Japanese patrols can close in. They guide the Americans away from roads and garrisons, hide them in farmhouses and villages, and move them along primitive tracks and trails that barely appear on any map. Their actions save most of the raiders, who would otherwise face capture, interrogation, or worse. At the same time, Japanese commanders respond with harsh force, launching campaigns to punish the regions that have sheltered American flyers. Entire towns and villages suffer as a direct consequence of the raid, bearing the weight of decisions made far out at sea. These reprisals become a grim reminder that the effects of a daring operation do not stop at the edge of the target city. The Doolittle Raiders' courage is never in doubt, but the path that carries them home is paved by the choices of Chinese allies and the suffering those choices draw down. People who never saw B-25 overhead still feel the impact of the mission in burned homes, lost family members, and tightened occupation. The raid story, therefore, is not only about ingenuity on a carrier deck and nerve over Tokyo, but also about the human cost paid on distant ground. That cost sits alongside the military results when we weigh what this single operation meant. In strictly physical terms, the Doolittle Raid inflicts limited damage. 16 medium bombers, each carrying a modest load, cannot knock out Japan's war industries or cripple its rail network in one morning. Factories and dockyards repair their buildings, patch roofs, and return to work. Anti-aircraft crews adjust their sights and procedures, using the experience to tighten future defenses. On the surface, the raid looks like a pinprick when measured against the vast campaigns that follow. Yet the true aftermath unfolds in hearts, minds, and planning rooms on both sides of the Pacific, where the sight and sound of American bombers over Tokyo carry far more weight than any single bomb crater. In the United States, news of the raid arrives at a time when war headlines are stubbornly bleak. The announcement that American aircraft have struck Tokyo and other cities provides a jolt of badly needed relief and pride. Newspapers run bold headlines across their front pages, and radio reports repeat the story again and again. The phrase Tokyo Raiders and the name of their leader, now promoted to Brigadier General, become shorthand for daring at a moment when the country needs proof that the tide can turn. For the men who flew the mission, official recognition stands in sharp contrast to private doubts they carried home. Some had expected criticism for the loss of every aircraft. Instead, they are honored for proving that distance and surprise can be bent to American advantage. In Japan, the raid cuts into the belief that the home islands are safely beyond reach. Seeing enemy bombers over the capital exposes gaps in early warning systems and air defenses that planners had not fully appreciated. In response, Japanese leaders pull fighter units and anti-aircraft assets back to protect key cities, thinning coverage elsewhere. They also intensify operations in China to tighten control over the regions that aided the raiders' escape and recovery. The psychological shock pushes strategic thinking in a specific direction. Protecting the home islands more aggressively and eliminating American carriers before they can strike again rises even higher on the list of priorities. Within months, decisions shaped in the raid's shadow help feed the chain of events that leads to the carrier clash at Midway. There, in a battle fought by scouts, dive bombers, and carriers far out at sea, Japan's naval air arm suffers losses that it cannot easily replace. The Doolittle Raid does not cause Midway by itself, but it tilts concerns, moves resources, and contributes to a sense of urgency around destroying American carriers. A small formation of bombers launched from a borrowed deck thus helps set the conditions for a larger turning point in the Pacific War. The line from one event to the other is not straight, but it is real. For students of military history, the Doolittle Raid endures as a case study in how an operation with modest immediate damage can carry outsized strategic and emotional impact. It shows how joint planning, improvisation, and a willingness to accept risk can reach across oceans and unsettle an opponent's plans. It also highlights the hidden costs paid by allies and civilians far from the initial headlines, whose lives are changed by decisions they never see. From a carrier deck crowded with Army bombers to the dark fields and villages of China, the raid draws a thin but powerful line between daring action and long-term consequence. That line still echoes in how nations think about surprise, morale, and the reach of air power. You have been listening to a Headline Wednesday story on the Doolittle Raid and the first American strike at the Japanese home islands. Headline Wednesday is developed by trackpads.com as part of Dispatch, U.S. Military History magazine.